Welcome, everyone. My name is Juliana. I'm not Josh Capel, but I'm honored to be standing in for him. I am an associate at the firm. I am joined today by Irina Maevska, one of my colleagues. She leads our psychedelic practice group. She started at Cooley and Corporate, but her love of psychedelics and plant medicine brought her to Johns Hopkins, where she was able to serve as a research assistant and guides early psilocybin sessions. And then she joined us in 2016, where she focuses on fostering the effective, safe, and legal use of psilocybin, ketamine, MDMA, and other entheogens. And we also are joined by our friend and colleague, Dr. Jacqueline Jock, who is a naturopathic doctor for more than 20 years. She's a leader in the medical nutrition and wellness industries. She's founded companies, formulated things, spoken on these topics, written about these topics. She knows a whole lot. So I'm very excited to be chatting with both of them and asking some questions. We are accepting questions in the chat. We're going to save some time at the end to run through questions from you all. And because we're a law firm, I'm just going to say nothing on this call today is to be construed as legal advice. We are more than happy to consult with you offline more formally. So with that, Verena, would you like to kick us off with a quick landscape overview?
Yeah, thanks, Juliana, and thank you, Jacqueline, for joining us. It's really great to have you. And thanks for everyone for joining the webinar. I know this is a hot topic because I have talked to many of the 90 of you that are on this call about these novel ingredients. It's really seems to be the time for a lot of companies to pivot from what we know to some of these novel ingredients. Some of you are in the Kratom space already. So it's a very timely conversation to have. And full disclosure, we don't have enough time to have this conversation properly in today's webinar. So let this just be, the start of the conversation. I'll cover some very basic legal landscape stuff. This might be, informative. I hope it's informative for many of you. For many of you, I know this is stuff that you guys know very well because you operate in this space, but we thought it would be useful to kick it off with kind of a quick summary of where we are legally speaking. And if you guys have been following it, there have been some changes published as of this morning. So it's an exciting time to talk about this. Okay, so at least 3 bodies of law will bear on any novel ingredient, including the substances that we're going to discuss today specifically. First, there's the Federal Controlled Substances Act, administered by the DEA. There's the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, again, federally administered by the FDA. And then there's state law, which has its own laws. And in some cases, there's county and municipal ordinances where localities can ban or regulate a particular substance. These 3 layers will operate independently and on top of each other, so a substance can be permitted under one and restricted in another. And to be a fully compliant product, it has to satisfy all 3 of these layers. So it's worth kind of keeping in mind. Okay, we'll dive right in with Kratom. We were just talking about the different pronunciations of it. If someone has a better pronunciation, I think Jacqueline does have a better pronunciation, please let me know. That's the one that's stuck in my head, so that's what you're going to have to hear for the course of this webinar from me. Kratom leaf is not federally controlled, as you guys know. Mitragynine or mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine, 7-OH, are also not scheduled under the CSA, with an important caveat that we're about to get into. Both are noted as DEA drugs of concern. In 2016, DEA started an emergency scheduling of mitragynine and 7-OH, and then it withdrew that attempt. We'll talk a little bit more about that. More notably, in July of this year, the DEA filed 2 separate notices of intent, of their intent to put certain substances related to kratom temporarily on the schedule. The first notice targeted 7-OH above a certain threshold, so it wasn't trace amounts of 7-OH naturally occurring in kratom leaf. But for plant material, it was 0.05% 7-OH by dry weight, and for extracts and processed products, it was 0.05 or 1 milligram, the 0.05 percentage by dry weight, or the 1 milligram per article. So depending on whether it was naturally occurring in plant material or an extract or processed, there were 2 different thresholds. Again, that was the first DEA notice. The second DEA notice targeted 3 related substances, mitragynine, pseudoindoxil, MP is what most people call it. There's other shorthands for it, MGM15 and MGM16. And those three substances that the second DEA notice targeted had no threshold, so any amount of those were intended to be scheduled. All three of those are semi-synthetic opioids made from kratom alkaloids. They're not straightforward extracts. You can't just extract it straight from the leaf. A chemist has to actually make them from metragonine or 7-OH through using specific chemical steps. And these notices did not cover botanical kratom leaf, as long as it didn't kick off the thresholds of 7-hydroxy in the first notice. So these actions were targeting concentrated and synthetic products only. And these notices of intent stated that a temporary scheduling order could be published on or after August 5th. August 5th came and went, and a lot of us who are watching this space noticed that they had not been scheduled. And then just as of this morning, yesterday, they filed their intent to publish, and this morning it was actually published in the Federal Register that the DEA has filed a temporary scheduling order, but only for the three substances covered by the second DEA notice of intent that I mentioned. So not the 7-hydroxy, but those three metragonine, pseudoindoxil, MGM15, and MGM16 have been actually published as a temporary scheduling order. It remains in effect from the date of publication, so from today for 2 years, so until August 26, 2028. There's a possibility of a 1-year extension. And I think a lot of the concern, there's some discussion about why the 7-hydroxy didn't go through. I think there's some strong lobbying, in favor of 7-hydroxy. I think there's some validity in the sense that I think these three, and Jacqueline would know better, but these three compounds that were scheduled have more potent opioid action, and I think they're strong agonists at the mu-opioid receptors, so their analgesic effects can be more potent than 7-hydroxy. I've heard they can be more potent than morphine, and they carry a lot of the other risks that we see mu-opioid agonists. Fentanyl is one, morphine is another, including the risk of dependence and addiction, the risk of respiratory depression. The first two, MGM15 and that MP ingredients, are currently manufactured and marketed in products, so they're being sold for people who are looking for that opioid effect. To my knowledge, MGM16 is not widely in the consumer market right now, but it's a similar highly potent compound that could be a very likely next substitute. So I think those concerns are why those got targeted. It might also be the lobbying. I don't think there's much lobbying in favor of these three substances. And it might also be that the threshold limits that they're trying to get right for 7-hydroxy, because it is naturally occurring in the kratom leaf, are not something that they want to. They don't want to schedule the naturally occurring trace amounts in the kratom leaf. So with 7-hydroxy, I know those threshold amounts were discussed, and they were trying to sort out what the right way to measure those thresholds were. So that could be another reason for the delay. I don't think it's not known out there exactly what happened, or if we will have a 7-hydroxy scheduling coming down the pike in the next week or two, but it's possible. Again, so that's the federal landscape right now. It's an exciting time. So that we don't spend all our time on kratom, I'll run through just some state law really quickly. So there are 9 states right now that outright ban kratom: Alabama, Arkansas, Connecticut, Indiana, Kansas, Louisiana, Tennessee, Vermont, and Wisconsin. California doesn't have it banned by statute, but it's basically, there's a de facto commercial ban enforced through their CDPH, and they've been pretty aggressive about enforcing against kratom. And then Massachusetts just temporarily banned kratom by emergency regulation, not through the legislature, and it takes effect, I think it's 2 days from now, might be 1 day, but I think it's 2 days from now. Rhode Island had in the past banned it, and was the first state to reverse that ban and instead implement a Kratom Act. Many other states, not all of them, but many of them have enacted KCPAs. So these are statutes based on the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, which is model legislation developed in cooperation with the American Kratom Association. And these KCPAs, these Kratom Consumer Protection Acts, tend to legalize and regulate kratom rather than prohibiting it. So you'll see 21 and up minimum age gating, accurate labeling, mandatory third-party lab testing, bans on certain types of adulterated or synthetic products, and some of these new ones are adding caps on 7-OH as we learn more about its effects and its risk. So we have some states that outright ban it, a few other states jumping on that bandwagon, a lot of states that regulate it, and a bunch of states that just don't address it at all. Some localities, as we discussed earlier, do outright ban it, even in states where it's not regulated. Um, okay, I'll leave that there for Kratom. There's a lot more we can say. We'll get into some more details and some interesting history, maybe if we have time with Jacqueline. Kava. Kava is legal at the federal level. It's not a controlled substance. It is a drug of concern for the DEA, but it's not scheduled. It's frequently sold as a dietary supplement. The FDA, I'm not getting into a lot of FDA law, just kind of touching on it in this webinar, but the FDA does not consider kava as generally recognized as safe for use in conventional foods and beverages. There's been some interesting wrinkles recently. If you look online, you'll see a lot of stakeholders in the kava space talking about FDA giving clarification through sort of non-formal means that just kava mixed with water is a traditional food. Anyway, call us or call another lawyer who knows the space if you want to discuss that, if that's relevant to your business. State and local rules, again, differ, right, from the federal level. Some cities do restrict kava beverages, including a New York restriction that was challenged and upheld in 2025. There's a lot of FDA analysis there doing the work. We won't get into the details there. And Jacqueline, again, will have some more questions for you on kava. Kanna is another big one, also not federally controlled, generally legal in the US and sold as a supplement, sold as a tincture, it's sold as powders, edibles, gummies. I'm not aware of any state ban at this point. The FDA and the FTC are kind of tracking it and watching it for labeling and health claims. Again, for the supplement part, there's another market that I've seen grow a lot over the last few years, marketing Kanna for recreational or euphoric effects or some sort of psychoactive effect or as an MDMA replacement. And that I think is a new and risky sort of area that the market is moving. It's going to invite some new unapproved new drug characterizations, and it could do some work to undermine the supplement characterization that it's sort of enjoyed up until now. Amanita muscaria is another one, and its constituents, again, not federally scheduled. You guys all know the red mushroom with the little white dots on it. It's kind of a classic in psychedelic and fairy tale literature. Mucimol, I think I'm pronouncing that correct, and ibotenic acid, two of its active constituents are also not listed in the Controlled Substances Act. So in almost all states, a person can legally buy, possess, and consume Amanita and Amanita-containing products. Louisiana is the only state that bans Amanita, interestingly, and Louisiana will come up a few times because they passed a Botanical Act that listed about 40 plants that are illegal when intended for human consumption, and Amanita is one of the ones covered there. The FDA did issue an affirmative, not generally recognized as safe determination and a letter to the industry in 2024 for Amanita. So unlike the other ones, the FDA does prohibit Amanita as a food additive, but it doesn't control personal possession. Some states like Florida and New York are starting to look into creating a regulation like a KCPA type of law with, or like a Delta 8 type of law with age limits and testing requirements. Let me see how we're doing on time. Okay. Blue Lotus is another one that comes up a lot. I've had a lot of clients and potential clients ask me about that. Also not a federally controlled substance, legal to possess and consume in 49 states. Louisiana's Botanical's ban for human consumption captures it, but again, because it's a human consumption law in Louisiana, it permits ornamental and decorative use. There's no approved food additive or generally recognized as safe basis for Blue Lotus in conventional foods, and there's no established dietary ingredient or new drug ingredient basis for it as a supplement. So the FDA has not approved Blue Lotus for any kind of human consumption. So ingestible products that are marketed for human consumption are going to be vulnerable there as being seen as adulterated or misbranded in theory, but it's not like, again, it's not contraband. It is often sold as a botanical, as a tea, as a decorative floral, or as incense online. And okay, let's move on. California poppy. This is another interesting one, not controlled at the federal or state level. It's also known as the California state flower, I believe. It's a really common ornamental plant. Its alkaloids that are active are not scheduled. It has a really long documented history in Western herbalism. So it's very likely been in use prior to this 1994 dietary ingredient cutoff that the FDA looks at, grandfathered in, that doesn't need a new drug NDI notification. It's often sold for sleep and anxiety, um, herbal supplement. I think that's probably sufficient there. That was a very quick run through the landscape. Kratom is obviously the kind of exciting movement because we're seeing things on a day by day basis here. Um, but we'll talk a little bit more about that and kind of get into some questions both from Juliana and from you guys. So with that, let me pass it off to Jacqueline. Jacqueline, tell us a bit about yourself and what you're seeing in the market these days.
Yeah, thank you. Gosh, that was a great run through for me too, because I actually hadn't even heard the news from this morning. So really super helpful, Brina. So thank you for that. I think you already got a little bit of my background, but I think friend of Vicente is just kind of maybe that's the most important part. But 27 years in the natural products industry, and it's hard to be that long doing what I do in the industry and not touch all things related to plants, which tends to bleed over into cannabis and psychedelics and everything else because in my world they're all plants. So it's kind of how I approach things. So um, I'm going to back us up a little bit if that's okay. Like I made some notes on a little bit of what Marina said, but when I was kind of invited to do this webinar, I think one of the things that was interesting to me is why are we having the conversation? Like why are we at this point in history where we're talking about in so much in popular culture about plants like kava and kratom and even California poppy, which is the state flower here in California where I live. Things that have had very, very long historical use. Like what's happening that's sort of bringing us to this point. And I think I look at it almost from, you know, a convergence of things that have happened that have brought us here. One, we know alcohol use is at basically a historic all-time low. I think, we're at like 54% of the population, which has certainly not occurred in my lifetime or probably the lifetime of most people sitting on this call today. At the same time, over the last decade or more, we've seen cannabis use significantly rise. And in most states where cannabis has been well accepted, it has filled a lot of what I will call that space that may have been more traditionally used by alcohol. So filled the space in social settings, filled the space for what people use to wind down and relax or use in social environments for social interaction. And with this particular strong growth in recent years in beverage. So again, like kind of we're going to have alcohol as beverage, the cannabis beverage market, which has grown significantly, especially for the low dose THC beverages over the past 5 years. We've seen huge growth there. And that has sort of come together with closer to my world, what I call the massive rise of the functional beverage space, where you can now, go online or walk into a convenience store and find your latest, greatest, whatever it's going to be, a mushroom energy electrolyte beverage. So, for lack of a better term. And, if we zoom out from that, we might ask the question of, what are humans doing here, right? And the most basic answer is that from all of the time that there have been humans, we have found ways to use substances in our environment recreationally. And a lot of that use has been as beverage. Even if you just look at the most basic level of coffee, tea, right? The things that we have used socially forever, those are plants, right? I like to just frame that out. We could over here throw nicotine in over here on the side, right? Tobacco, also a plant. And around the world, so coca leaf has been used as a tea traditionally, in major parts of Latin America. So we see that this has not just been isolated to one geography or one culture, but it has been something that has been done around the world. I can move that into American pop culture, and most people forget where the name Coca-Cola came from. But just as a general reminder, Coca-Cola was one of the first functional beverages. Coca coming from coca leaf, which is Where it still comes from today, Coca-Cola Company, I think, is the single largest importer of coca in the United States. They get a coca extract that comes from Anaco in Peru that is made, specifically fit to purpose, that it is decocainized coca extract, but they're able to put that still to this day in Coca-Cola. But the cola is also an herb, initially was anyway. It's now been replaced with, I think, standardized caffeine, but cola nut, another plant that's a caffeine containing plant that was put together with cocaine. Think of that coca leaf and caffeine, right? That is definitely an uplifting beverage if you ever had one. So to kind of bring this closer to where Barina started, I think as we've seen alcohol consumption go down, as we're kind of sitting on the near-term horizon of tighter scheduling for THC, right? Which I think the horizon for that, Barina, or Juliana, you can confirm that, but I think we've got a November date, right? That's kind of looming on the horizon that's going to really probably, at least in the short term, really change that landscape for our low-dose THC beverages that have been like the hemp-derived THC category. I think that's pushing people to ask the question, both from a personal use standpoint and especially from a commercial standpoint of what do we move to? From my perspective as someone who's been involved in formulation for a long time, some part of that certainly is about what's legal and what's safe. The other part of it is just really answering the question of why, like, why are we doing it? What's the experience that we're trying to give to people? We have a fairly predictable experience from alcohol that we know what it is. It's disinhibition, relaxation, eventually, more and more of that as you consume more and more of it. We know with stimulants like a caffeine that we tend to get an energizing effect. We tend to get a mental and real effect in the brain where people often feel more focused and more focused attention. So now when we start to broaden our horizon, we look at this bigger landscape of plants, I think people are asking two questions, like which ones give us the experience we want? And then also, honestly, how fast is the other question I get asked all the time is how long is it going to take? Is this going to be a rapid onset, predictable experience like we know that we can get with alcohol or cannabis, where we kind of have an understanding of how long it takes from the time you put something in your mouth to how you feel it and how quickly you feel it, and also what you feel? Or is it going to be really unpredictable, right? And we have better answers for some of these substances that have very long historical use than we do as others. For example, we have really pretty good data on that for things like kava, because it's been in historical use as well as in commercial use for a long, 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 long time. Historical use going back centuries, and commercial use going back many, many decades. So we understand it well. Others, we understand a lot less well. So some of the things that we see people using, we don't, I've seen Blue Lotus, for example, more recently. And if you were to ask me about the time of onset for Blue Lotus, I would, probably be hard pressed to find the data for you that would demonstrate what that sort of onset curve looks like. So the final thing I think I would say is, I think this kind of goes to like this new scheduling of like these derivatives of compounds from plants, right? Is that we have in almost all of these cases a plant and a traditional way it was used. Kava is a great example of that. Traditionally used as kind of a maceration in a pure water sort of extract, right? And it's very different if we create a CO2 extract, or we create an ethanol extract, or we get into synthesizing or isolating individual compounds like individual kava lactones. Some of them have similar activities, some of them have very different activity. Like there's a range of kind of pharmacology that these things have. So, I think most people are familiar with this example in cannabis, that isolated THC is not the same as, ingesting or smoking whole leaf cannabis. It's just not the same thing. Isolated CBD is a completely different experience for people than isolated THC, and they develop side by side in the same plant, right? So we really have to think about, again, like looking from that top perspective down of, is it legal? Is it safe? What's the experience we're trying to create? And then, are we talking about a more traditional use of a whole plant for people, or are we talking about an isolated, you know, compound from a plant that may have very unique and more, different pharmacology if we isolate it from the rest of the plant material and sort of remove that ability to have the natural entourage effect of the compounds within the plant. So, I think just from a framework, I was thinking about just maybe adding a couple things to what you said, Barina, just on a couple of footnotes. Um, Kava, it does not have, like from an FDA standpoint, does not have a new dietary ingredient notification. And I think, as you mentioned, is not, GRAS, with the exception of the state of Hawaii, created their own GRAS carve out for Kava, which makes sense. They're part of Polynesia, and this is where this plant has centuries of historical use. I had the privilege of going to the Big Island late last year and visiting this beautiful sort of regenerative organic kava farm and drinking like kava like fresh off the farm. It is a beautiful part of the culture there and just really clearly makes sense in the context of the culture of Hawaii. Um, and from a standpoint of really how it's been treated for the most part in dietary supplements, it's been treated really as an old dietary ingredient because it has had such long historical use. The question really has been the extracts. So there's been some safety concerns that have been raised about kava over the years. Most of those have largely been like revealed as being not real concerns. But if they do come down to anything, it tends to be a question of the extraction method and particularly water extraction versus ethanolic extraction and the different chemical profiles that are produced when you do that. And then I think the other one that you mentioned that is Kanna. So Kanna has both FDA GRAS and an NDIN. We've had it as a dietary supplement. I was trying to remember, should have looked this up, but at least since 2013 and maybe since 2011, because of the Zembrin product, which has been a branded ingredient in the market for I mean, at least half of my career. It's been around for a very long time and went through extremely straightforward regulatory pathways when it came to the US market. And I don't think anyone really questioned it for any other reason. The only interesting thing I've seen with Kanna, and I know this came up because I'm a member of the American Herbal Products Association, is that uh, Amazon has it listed as drug paraphernalia, which I think goes to kind of the point that you made, Barina, about some part of this is for some of these plants, real potential safety concerns. In this case, my read of this for Kanna is entirely the language people are using to promote it in some cases. We don't really have any significant data of Kanna, at least not in the way we've used it traditionally and as a plant or in dietary supplements as being unsafe, with the exception of it may have some drug interactions that are, if people are taking antidepressants that are worth being aware of. But when people start promoting it like a psychedelic drug, for example, when people start saying, oh no, if you put this into a powder and you put it up your nose, it's like cocaine, or you're going to get this experience if you take enough of this plant that's going to be like MDMA, that is sort of guilt by association. And we see increasingly crackdown by that method on all kinds of, sort of platforms. So Amazon being one, we've seen similar, it's not really the same category, but like DHEA for right now is going through a moment on all of Meta and TikTok Shop and at Ulta because I think people are talking about it like it's an anabolic steroid. And so when you start associating a compound, even if it is safe and has a long history of, safe use in humans, but you start talking about it like it is something that is a scheduled substance, then we sometimes run into restrictions on the ability to sell it that have nothing to do with the substance itself and purely to do with what humans are saying. So I'm going to pause there because I feel like I've said a lot.
No, thank you.
Sure.
Um, I'm actually going to start by asking you, Jacqueline, at a
Mhm.
high level, what do you think of the variety of Kratom products in the market right now?
Yeah, I mean, I went through a period a couple of years ago where I just like I went and bought like a ton of them. It was just like I'm gonna self-sample and like try a bunch of these things. And um They vary a lot, at least, both from what I'm able to see on labels and from what my own personal sort of N of one sampling experience was. And when I say I sampled, I tried everything. I bought just straight leaf tea, which is one whole experience, and then I bought some shots and some beverages and then some gummy products and tried them all. They vary enormously in terms of like content and experience. Um, the teas were lovely and nice and what you would expect from just like a nice relaxing beverage that you might want to have in the evening before you go to bed. That was kind of my experience of the teas. Some of the other things varied from being sedative to very mind altering, which on the case of one product led me to phone some friends at laboratories and say, has anybody ever tested this? And do you know what's in it? Because the experience of it was so, I suspect there was probably one of these things that Marina mentioned that are some kind of semi-synthetic, very potent product in there. And at the end of the day, I was very glad that I had only taken half of it and um, only had to excuse myself from meetings for half a day, why I just sort of laid semi-comatose on a couch. So that for me was the personal sort of variability. So I think like if I was going to argue for anything as someone who just does a lot of formulation, it would be as much transparency as we can have. We need to really have, at least on the side of consumer goods, good, analytical methods. We need to have a good understanding of dosing and standardization of the botanicals so that we can provide, predictable guidance to people taking these products. I think the bigger dangers run into either when we don't have transparency, particularly that consumers can understand, and that we end up with people getting experiences that they're not wanting or not prepared for.
Cool. No, thank you for that. And I guess what are you actually seeing clinically in terms of dependence and withdrawal from
Yeah,
these
I don't
products?
I don't work as a clinician, so let me just say this out loud, but I do talk to people who do. And I know like one of the things I did earlier this year was I spent some time volunteering at in Mexico at an Ibogaine program. And it was very clear from the clinicians there that they are increasingly seeing kratom or kratom withdrawal as one of the things that is like increasingly driving people into treatment with ibogaine, which I thought was an interesting sort of independent point of validation that at least for some number of people, um, the compounds from this plant are causing enough problems for them that they're seeking treatment for symptoms and for dependency.
And as we were just speaking to regarding the scheduling, we have this line between trace amounts of 7-OH that exists in the plant compound, in the plant leaf itself, and then the concentrated semi-synthetic 7-OH, one being treated very opioid-like,
Yeah.
the other not really. Is this a sound distinction based on your experience and
I
expertise?
I think it probably is, to be perfectly honest. Again, I mean, I'm going to go back to like, we always have to ask ourselves anytime we're moving away from traditional use use of a plant and traditional methods of processing of what are we then delivering to the people who are going to ingest this thing. And um, I did do a few years ago because this came up in another work environment I was in. I went into the FAERS database, which is the Federal Adverse Events database for people who aren't familiar, and I pulled, I think it was well over 1,000 adverse events that were attributed to Kratom, and I spent days reading them. Which was very educational. And what I will say is two patterns really emerged. And I think one is very telling of the way that people at least have historically used this plant is there's been a lot of historical use of this plant for people trying to wean themselves off of opiates at home and by on their own. And when you look at the overdose reports, most of the people who overdose, the report reads like a list of drugs that are found for people, almost always multiple opiates and kratom as a plant, and probably benzodiazepines and maybe some other things in there as well. Which leads me to my final point is that it's amazing to me that you can list 7 things in a person's body and say, oh, well, 6 of these were in the known therapeutic range, but there was also this plant. So it was obviously the plant that killed people, which is how a lot of the FAERS database reads. Now, I don't want to pass judgment on the people writing those reports or, doing those investigations, but I think it does come back to how are we educating people? And especially how are we educating people who are vulnerable and people who are in need? And that's something I really do have a huge concern about. Weaning off of opiates, be they, an opiate-like compound that is derived from, uh, you know, Kratom or a synthetic opiate, it's dangerous for people to do. And there's a lot of, ways that that can go wrong, and there's a lot of ways that people can die doing it. So, we need to have like better education, and we can't just tell people, oh, well, this is just a safe way to do this. Like that cannot be the messaging that we send to people. So that doesn't quite answer your question, but I think it does lead me to believe that we should be thinking very carefully about what of these compounds we do allow generally into commerce. And maybe on the other side, there is a valuable role for some of the more potent compounds that are being, either extracted or derived from kratom being used in, medical settings to actually either for pain treatment itself or for weaning people off of pain medications. I think all those are possible.
And speaking to the way that these interact in our brain, where does 7-OH sit relative to classical opioids on receptor binding, potency, respiratory depression risk? Is it more potent than morphine, as sometimes
My
people
gosh,
say?
I don't know if I have the actual answer to that. We might need a Kratom expert. Maybe we have one on the call who actually knows. Like I know it has similar receptor binding. And I know that relative to some of the other compounds. Oh, there we have Dell. Dell will know the answer. Hey,
Mm.
Dell. I'm seeing him pop in there. Um, we can just read whatever if Dell knows, oh no, he's commenting on Kava. Okay. I thought maybe Dell might know the answer on to your question, but I
No, no problem.
somebody,
TBD.
somebody might. Del might.
Mm.
Yeah.
So if we do see the scheduling of 7-OH, Jacqueline, do you have any idea who is reaching for those concentrated 7-OH extracts and why?
Yeah.
Is there a concern that some of these users may find themselves going to the black market where things are unregulated and not above ground?
Yeah. I mean, I'm always for having regulation because regulation tends to bring standards and tends to bring transparency, right? I think we need to be careful about how we do it. Like this is actually how I got to know you guys at Vicenni was talking about a lot of these things early on about cannabis, right? And we should learn from cannabis when we look at this, right? That's just one sort of footnote. But I do think that having regulations that set, standards for purity, potency, methods, like even solvent levels, things like that, are all an important part of creating safe marketplaces. And, whatever side of scheduling that ends up on is actually something I am personally in many ways less concerned with, probably than other people are. Because I think to your point, Juliana, people are going to find the kind of experience that they want. And, if that experience is I want to, get very high from something. I would rather have people to have access to do that in a way that I believe is going to be most safe for them, rather than where we see problems like with the black market. I mean, I've literally seen testing on products that I saw. I talked to a lab a couple of years ago that showed me their random sampling of Amanita gummies from the market, and I was kind of appalled at what they found. And most of them had no amanita in them at all, but they had a
Mm.
whole range of other things from melatonin and dextromethorphan to like, unscheduled like opiate compounds. And I thought, wow, that is incredibly unsafe. Like no matter what else you want to say about it. So, that's gonna always be available to people. And it becomes, I think, an increasing draw for people to turn towards less safe choices if they don't have safe choices. And, I guess that's how I think about it.
Mm.
I'm a
Yeah.
doctor fundamentally. I just want people to like have the safest way to do things.
No, thank you. Brina, I'm gonna direct this one to you first.
Mm.
The DEA tried to schedule Kratom once in 2016 and withdrew that under public and scientific pressure. What do you think is different this time?
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting case. In August actually, all this stuff happens in the summer. In August of 2016, they issued a notice of intent to schedule metragonine and 7-hydroxy under Schedule 1 under their emergency authority. And then they got such a backlash that I would consider mostly political and social, not like a big scientific change or scientific response. Um, I think 51 members of Congress publicly opposed it. There was a bipartisan letter written. There was a lot of people coming forward that you don't think of as typical drug users or drug addicts, talking about how much it benefited them and why it was necessary. And then in October of that year, they withdrew their emergency scheduling notice and decided not to go forward. And then there was a lot of further kind of FDA, HHS movements back and forth following that in 2017. I'd say a lot is different. In 2016, because they were trying to schedule, their intent was to schedule the two main alkaloids of kratom leaf. It was going to effectively prohibit any kratom at all. Um, the whole botanical is used by, a tremendous amount of people back then and today. Whereas this year's, it's very narrow, even if the notice of intent for the first one that hasn't actually gone through to an actual scheduling yet goes through, it's going to be concentrated and semi-synthetic derivatives that have no threshold. That's the one that did go through. And then if the 7-OH one that does go through, it expressly excludes the trace amounts that occur in the leaf. So this year's is not trying to grab kind of the entire kratom leaf, and I think that's really meaningful. Like the DEA sort of learned its lesson from 2016 and decided to go after the concentrates and not get sunk by the argument, the political argument of you're trying to ban a natural plant that helps a lot of people. That's sort of what sank them back then. Um, Also, like the product category that is being scheduled now wasn't really a thriving market in 2016, at least not to my knowledge. We didn't have this huge, all these different extracts, all these different concentrates, semi-synthetic compounds, all, downstream of kratom leaf itself. The size of that market really emerged recently. So now the DEA, I think, is acting in response to that rather than repeating its mistakes about kratom. Um, and I mean, we already have a different outcome. That's different, like we actually have something that has a scheduling order, as of today. So it's not like up in the air whether anything will move forward. So its notices of intent did actually bear fruit. At least one of them did as of today. Um, and I think there was much more unification of the people against the scheduling back in 2016. The industry, advocates, individuals, scientists, politicians, everyone was like, what are you doing? Like, why? Not everyone, but a lot of people were on the same side saying, why are you trying to schedule this whole leaf plant? And this time, I think the industry is way more split, whereas people who are advocates of the whole leaf actually do support scheduling the concentrates and the extracts and the synthetics to try to protect the plant, whereas other trade groups, oppose it depending on what side they're on. So I don't think we have this same unified front against it. I think that's it. Yeah, I think we're in a very different situation with what the DEA is trying to do now.
Thank you. I'm going to switch gears to Kava. Brina, can you speak to the old hepatotoxicity concern that drove FDA's advisory some years ago?
Yeah, I mean, actually, Jacqueline might be in a better position to talk about what we believe on hepatotoxicity, but in general, my understanding is that like there was a real concern about hepatotoxicity, and it's basically not really borne out the way that we believe. I think kava can have liver risks if used inappropriately or at a very high amount or very frequently. Again, this is not fully my wheelhouse, but that's my understanding, and I think those concerns are not. Um, they're better understood today and they're not as believable or believed I think culturally as they were then.
Yeah, this really
Jacqueline, do you have
comes
anything to
down,
add?
yeah, absolutely. This really comes down to, I think, kind of what I was alluding to with the intersection of sort of extraction method, but also uh, plant parts, for lack of a better word. Like we're seeing an interesting thing happening in a parallel with ashwagandha right now, where people are like, hey, we've only ever used the root of this plant, and now people are using the, the aerial parts of the plant. Um, One thing that really kind of came out of that sort of questioning around kava and hepatotoxicity was some deeper questioning within the industry of what are people using? Like, what are they doing? So for kava, this gets a little bit complicated, and I don't want to go in deep depth in this, but basically you have noble kavas and you have non-noble kavas. The noble ones are the ones that really were much more traditionally used, like socially and ceremonially. It's the underground parts of the plant or the root structures that have really been used for these purposes. And when people started moving more and more demand into, there was more sort of consumer demand, um, people started using both more of the non-noble kavas and also using more of the aerial parts of the plant. And in those cases, you get more of these compounds that are called flavocavains, and the flavocavains have been the ones that have been most tied to hepatotoxicity. I know that I have some people that I work with that we have all kinds of differing opinions about that, but that sort of is the most consistent story, is that particularly ethanolic extracts that include higher concentrations of flavocavains are probably, more risky, which again just sort of comes back to the more that we have good testing methodologies and good standardization and good agreement about what are the acceptable, you know, extraction methods and plant parts that we can use in commerce, the better it is for everyone.
Jacqueline, are you seeing any interesting clinical or recreational benefits with kava?
Kava is it's one of my favorite plants. So, I mean, I really actually like the fact that we're seeing more kava used in what I would call traditional social settings, because I think it actually is a plant that that translates well to social use when it's done correctly. And at least here in Southern California, we're seeing it, even with some of the restrictions, like my county, Orange County has some localized restrictions on kava. But we are seeing that there is more use of this plant. I think, I mean, kava bars, I don't know how many of them have popped up around the country, but it seems like they're kind of all over the place. And I'm even seeing, you know, relatively, some brands kind of move more mainstream, like True Kava and Camelo and some of these others that have really kind of moved. Even like Sprouts has like a whole selection of kava beverages now, which I think is fantastic. So, um,
Are there drug interactions that consumers or retailers should be worried about?
probably the biggest one would be like co-use with like significant sedatives. But that's sort of with anything that's hitting GABA receptors, right? So we probably have like a big social experiment of a fair number of people right now combining kava with alcohol, and I don't think we're seeing like a flood of them showing up in emergency rooms at this point in time.
I've
So
heard a lot of that too, Jacqueline, just,
yeah,
anecdotally and through the various psychedelic scenes. There's definitely a lot of kava and alcohol combination or
yeah,
alcohol replacement with
yeah.
kava.
I generally speaking, I would just say to people like choose your swim lane and like do one and not the other, but that's would be my personal advice to people. Yeah.
And then switching to Kanna, Jacqueline, what clinical and recreational benefits are you seeing there?
Yeah, I mean, Kanna has a as I said, a long history of use, like in very mainstream dietary supplement use, primarily for anxious mood and depressed mood. That's really the primary place that it has been used. It has, depending on whose research you read, if we have a pharmacologist on here, I would welcome their comments, but you kind of see like claims around SSRI type activity or SNRI activity or MAO activity. And, so the only real caution that we've traditionally given people is to, um, to really probably have some scrutiny of not in using Kana regularly if you're taking certain classes of antidepressants. But outside of that, as I said, the safe history of use in dietary supplements is well established and long. I think the trend that we've seen recently um, that I think deserves a little more scrutiny are, it's kind of like what we're talking about with Kratom too. is people forcing extraction methods to get very, very high levels of the Kanna alkaloids. And, my understanding of those alkaloids is that they have kind of like a little bit of like a bell curve effect, that on like the upslope, they're a little bit more stimulating, and on the downslope, they're more of a sedative. So as you kind of get into higher levels, they become sedating. So I think this is where, again, we really need to know, first of all, if some of those newer extracts fit under the current regulatory framework that we have for Kanna, which I suspect that they don't, because the GROS and the NDIN, I believe, were both based on the very precise extraction from Zembrin, which is a very well standardized product. So I think the only thing that sort of remains unclear to me is, how do we need to look at some of these newer extracts that have come into the market relative to what was the basis for the GROS and the NDIN in the past?
Jacqueline, do you have any way of estimating what percentage of the market is not Zembrin?
I, you know, I probably can't get that spontaneously sitting right here, but I could try to get like a read on that if you want me to go look it up later.
No, I was just curious
Um,
if you had an off
I
the
don't,
top of your head guess, not like a
I,
real figure.
yeah, there's only really a couple others that have, like, extracts that have made their way into more mainstream dietary supplements, primarily one called Cebrium. It's another South African one that's made through a DCD process. And that's the only one I see commonly like presented at industry events, like for formulation. So I would say it's probably still mostly Zembrin, just because it has had such a long, foothold in the supplement space, and people know the company, and they know you know, they know the scientists who worked on it. Like it's just a sort of a staple, if you will.
Thanks.
Um, what other novel substances are you seeing? Are there any particularly that are exciting and concerning? And I'll start with you, Verena.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, I'm glad you asked because Jack and I have totally nerded out about other novel substances. I don't know that we want to give you guys like a, to try or to manufacture list. But we had a lot of fun kind of discussing the whole like botanical herbal landscape. But I'm glad you asked this because it's a good intro to for me to say something that I sort of neglected and I should have touched on in the beginning when I was talking about the legal structure. When we're talking federal, it's not just the Controlled Substances Act, but it's also the Analog Act. And a lot of times, as my clients and potential clients who are getting very creative looking for new novel substances, they're coming to me with substances like 4-HOMET or 4-HOMIPT. And I know there was a question about what I believe is like a synthetic opioid that's sort of on the verge of being scheduled in the Q&A. The issue with a lot of these is that you have to understand how the Analog Act works. And the Analog Act is the government's way of grabbing substances that are not already in the list of controlled substances and covering them anyway. And a good Analog Act analysis is like, it's like a real memo, or it's something you should talk to an attorney about. It's not something I'm going to cover in 2 minutes on a webinar here, but it's something that should be on the back of your minds if you guys are businesses looking for different substances to work with. And basically, if a substance has a structure, a chemical structure similar to a scheduled substance, and it also has even the word also there, it's actually written as a disjunctive or in the law, but in its application, it's been treated as an and. But basically, if it has, let's go with and for now, because it's a little more functional. If it has a structure, chemically speaking, to a controlled substance, and it has a function on the human central nervous system that's similar to a controlled substance, then it becomes a candidate for being treated as an analog to a controlled substance, which means the government will treat it as though it's a controlled substance if, and this is sort of the third prong or the independent third part, if it's sold intended for human consumption. So this is a really important thing for you guys to kind of keep in the back of your mind and, understand better if it's relevant to what you do, that a lot of things that are not yet scheduled are still swept up by this Analog Act analysis. And you'll see a lot of people, and if you guys are anywhere on the internet looking at this stuff, you'll see a lot of people trying to sell it just with a label that it's not intended for human consumption. And that label does not do the work that these businesses want it to do. You know, just saying that it's not sold for human consumption doesn't mean it's not sold for human consumption under the Analogue Act analysis. So it will be treated as a controlled substance if a substance fails, let's say, this Analogue Act analysis. So it's an important piece to keep in mind and a question that comes up over and over again with these novel substances. I just wanted to kind of put in that buzzkill, bummer moment. And Jacqueline, do you have anything you want to mention? Any novel substances that you are seeing or anything that
I
really
get
worries
asked
you
by
out
like
there?
every plant in the entire world. I think the other place that things get restricted, Marina, is with import bans, right? We were
Definitely.
talking about this. I've been asked at least a couple of times about cot in the last couple of years. And I think that's subject to a fairly stringent import ban, at least from the best of my knowledge. I'm open to everybody's question. I mean, I literally like the things that come across my desk. Like probably the most interesting one I saw at an investor pitch recently was a company that is um, selling Banisteriopsis caapi as a like which is half of ayahuasca, but it's the unscheduled half of ayahuasca. At least in the US, it's I think it's scheduled in Canada, but at least in the US on this side of the border, it's unscheduled, and they have developed all the documentation to show that they have an ODI, an old dietary ingredient, and they've got a dossier they're presenting on it, and they're out fundraising. So they actually won the pitch. So I was like,
Um,
wow, this is
Fascinating.
fascinating.
For that to become sort of mainstream is really interesting. I was very aware of that being sort of passed around in the underground, let's say, without
Yeah.
any like, commercialization as like an independent way to work with the plant.
Harmala alkaloids by themselves occur in lots of places in nature. We have them in passion flower, for example. So Passiflora has not Harmala alkaloids, it's beta carbolines, but they're all sort of in the same sort of umbrella. That company, people want to look at it. The company's called Happy Cappy. They're really
It's a
it's
great name.
cutest like group of founders. They're just like very enthusiastic about what they're doing. But I think people are again, like I would say the number of things that people are starting to kind of reach for, be it, older things, that have been around a long time, like Kanna or like Damiana, or even just kind of reaching into the toolkit of plants like valerian for relaxation. Like I think we're just getting to the point now where people are looking for how they can create an experience and what are the things that are most likely to create that experience in a predictable way. So, um,
I have a few questions from our listeners that I
Juliana,
wanted to
maybe we
get.
can each grab a couple ones quickly. We don't have a lot of time, but
No, we
Jacqueline, if you want to
don't.
answer one, and I was going to answer the SR
Yeah.
17018.
oh, I can't answer
Mary
that.
was asking, has
Good.
that had a DA notice filed? To my knowledge, and please don't rely on me here because this is not a substance that I'm very familiar with, that it has had a notice of intent to be scheduled, but the actual scheduling has not come down yet. So it's sort of like where we were with these two 7-OH and metragonine related compounds like 2 days ago. Like they've said they have a notice to intent to file. I think the waiting period is up, but the actual scheduling has not come down yet and could at any moment. That's what I believe. Please do double check me on that if that information is important to you.
And I'm happy to take Mary's second question. If kava is not grass, how are the FDA labeling requirements met for beverages? That's something we deal with oftentimes with the hemp THC beverage side of things, even though hemp THC is not considered to be a grass food additive. It is a best practice and mitigates regulatory risk to follow the FDA labeling guidelines because you are marketing the product as a traditional beverage, even though it might not pass muster given some of the additives. So
Mhm.
that's more of a risk mitigatory thing than a legal sanctioning, if that makes sense. And then
Mhm.
this one's somewhat interesting, and we can end on this one. So like the peptides that are being pushed as injections to mimic a GLP-1, would those compounds fall under the Analogue Act based on your
But
understanding of the analysis?
yeah, let me answer that. I don't think they would fall under the Analog Act. I'm not sure. I haven't actually thought about that, but I don't think it would have a similar. I sort of quickly said the Analog Act piece, but it has to do with there's a structure, the chemical structure, which is a factual question, and then the function is like it's like a stimulating, hallucinogenic, and I forget the other one, but it's like certain types of effects on the human nervous system, not any effect. So I don't think the GLP-1 type of activity would pass that second prong of it. I'm sure there's other legal gray area reasons why they're marketing it as not for human consumption, but I don't think it's an Analog Act question. Again, off the top of my head.
And we are unfortunately out of time. As you anticipated, Marina, we could go on for hours. So I appreciate everyone tuning in today. I appreciate the time of our guest speakers. And again, if you want to keep chatting with us, we are here to talk about these substances. Thank you all.
Yeah, Jacqueline, thank you so much for joining.
Ah,
Really appreciate your presence.
super fun. Thanks. It's just nice to get to see you guys for an hour. So enjoyed it.
Always good to see you.
Thank
Okay,
you.
take care, guys. Thanks everyone for
Bye.
Thanks,
joining.
everyone.